I was sitting at my sister's dinner table, surrounded by her perfect life and her judgmental stares, when she told me to stay quiet because I was embarrassing the family with my unemployment. What she didn't know was that my phone had been buzzing all evening with calls from my CEO. And when he finally walked through her front door unannounced, looking for me with the biggest news of my career, the silence that followed her gasps was worth every month of hiding the truth about my real job. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The rain hammered against the windows of Rebecca's suburban home as I sat at her mahogany dining table, picking at the overpriced catered food she'd ordered for what she called a family intervention. My sister had always been the golden child, married to a successful lawyer, living in her pristine two-story house in Westfield, driving her BMW that she somehow managed to mention in every conversation we had. I smoothed down my thrift store blouse and tried to ignore the way her husband Marcus kept glancing at his Rolex, as if my presence was costing him money by the minute. Their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, were upstairs supposedly doing homework, but I could hear them giggling and probably live streaming on social media from their matching MacBooks. "So, Natalie," Rebecca began, setting down her wine glass, with that practiced precision she'd perfected since marrying into money, "we need to talk about your situation." I knew exactly what situation she meant. For the past 8 months, I'd been telling my family I was between jobs, picking up freelance work here and there. It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The reality was far more complicated than anything my conventional sister could wrap her head around. "I'm doing fine, Becca," I said, using the nickname I knew she hated now that she thought it sounded too casual for her new social circle. "Fine?" She let out that laugh, the one that sounded like breaking crystal. "Natalie, you're 32 years old. You live in a studio apartment above that Vietnamese restaurant in downtown Springfield. You drive a car that's older than some of my students." Rebecca taught 4th grade at a private school. Something she never let me forget was so much more respectable than my previous job in what she called that chaotic startup world. She had no idea that the startup world had evolved, that some of us had learned to navigate it in ways she couldn't imagine. "Your lifestyle isn't sustainable," Marcus chimed in, adjusting his designer glasses. "Rebecca and I have been discussing it, and we think you need structure, discipline. Maybe it's time to consider something more traditional." I bit my tongue. Marcus worked at his father's law firm, had never taken a real risk in his life, and somehow felt qualified to lecture me about career choices. But I'd learned to pick my battles with my family, especially when I was sitting in their house, eating their food, and listening to their unsolicited advice. "I've actually been working," I said carefully. "Just not in the traditional sense." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Working where? Doing what? Because last I checked, you couldn't even afford to split the check when we went to lunch last month." That stung because it was true. I'd had to decline their invitation to Marcus's birthday dinner at that expensive steakhouse downtown. I'd claimed, I was sick, but really, I couldn't afford the $150 it would have cost me just for my portion of the meal. What they didn't understand was that my financial situation was more complex than it appeared. "I'm consulting," I said, which was true enough. "Remote work. It's project-based, so the income varies." "Consulting for whom?" Rebecca pressed. "What kind of projects?" Before I could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her expression changed, the way it always did when she got a text from someone important in her social hierarchy. "Oh, perfect," she said, her voice taking on that artificially bright tone. "Jennifer Morrison is stopping by. You remember Jennifer, right? She's the one who runs that successful marketing agency downtown. The one who just bought the house on Elm Street for $2.3 million. I did remember Jennifer Morrison. We'd gone to high school together, and she'd always been the type to turn every conversation into a business opportunity. Rebecca had stayed in touch with her specifically because Jennifer represented everything my sister thought I should aspire to be. Maybe you could talk to her about opportunities, Rebecca continued. She might know of some entry-level positions that could get you back on track. Entry-level positions. I almost laughed, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. My phone buzzed in my purse, and I glanced at it discreetly. Another missed call from the same number that had been trying to reach me all day. I'd been avoiding it because I wasn't ready for that conversation, not here, not now. Actually, I said, I should probably head home soon. I have some work to finish tonight. What work? Marcus asked skeptically. I thought you said your projects were inconsistent. Rebecca stood up and started clearing the plates with sharp, precise movements. Honestly, Natalie, I'm worried about you. We all are. You used to be so ambitious, so driven. What happened to the sister who graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern? What happened to the girl who had that internship at Goldman Sachs? What happened was that I'd learned that traditional paths weren't always the right paths. What happened was that I'd discovered opportunities in places my family couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge. But explaining that to Rebecca would be like trying to describe color to someone who'd only ever seen in black and white. My phone buzzed again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. The caller ID showed a name that would mean nothing to my family, but everything to my future. David Chen, CEO of Meridian Technologies. I need to take this, I said, standing up from the table. During dinner? Rebecca's voice rose an octave. Natalie, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't even be present for a family conversation without some distraction. But I was, already walking toward the kitchen, pressing the answer button. David, hi. I'm so sorry I missed your earlier calls. Natalie, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all day. Where are you? We need to talk. I'm at my sister's house. Family. Dinner. Can this wait until tomorrow? No, it really can't. I'm actually in Springfield tonight for the Morrison Industries meeting. What's your sister's address? I'm coming over. My heart stopped. David, you don't need to. I'm already in my car. Text me the address. This news can't wait. The line went dead. I stood in Rebecca's pristine kitchen, surrounded by granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that cost more than most people's cars, trying to process what had just happened. In about 20 minutes, my entire carefully constructed separation between my family life and my professional life was about to collapse. I walked back to the dining room where Rebecca and Marcus were having a whispered conversation that stopped. Abruptly when I appeared, "Everything okay?" Rebecca asked, but her tone suggested she hoped it wasn't. Actually, I said, sitting back down, my boss is coming over. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Your boss? The CEO of the company I work for. He's in town and wants to discuss some business matters. Rebecca's expression shifted from skepticism to curiosity. What company? Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Rebecca glanced toward the front door, then back at me. That's probably Jennifer, she said, but uncertainty crept into her voice. The doorbell rang again, followed by a firm knock. Through the frosted glass panels beside the front door, I could see two figures waiting on the porch. Rebecca smoothed her hair and walked to the entrance, Marcus trailing behind her. I stayed seated at the dining table, my hands folded in my lap, trying to look calmer than I felt. The sound of the front door opening carried through the house, followed by Rebecca's voice, bright and welcoming. Jennifer, so good to see you. Come in, come in. But then there was another voice, deeper, unfamiliar to my family, but achingly familiar to me. Actually, we're looking for Natalie Rodriguez. Is she here? David Chen stepped into Rebecca's foyer like he owned every room he entered, which, considering his net worth, wasn't far from the truth. Behind him stood Jennifer Morrison, looking equally polished but slightly confused about why Springfield's most reclusive tech mogul was accompanying her to a casual family dinner. Natalie, David said, his eyes scanning the room until they found. There you are. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Marcus straightened his tie nervously, probably recognizing David's face from the business section of the newspaper. Jennifer looked between all of us, clearly trying to piece together connections that didn't make sense to her either. "David, what are you doing here?" I asked, standing up from the dining table with as much composure as I could muster. "I told you, we need to talk." The board meeting concluded an hour ago. His gaze swept across my family members, taking in their expensive but conservative clothing, the perfectly staged home decor, the obvious wealth that tried too hard to announce itself. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Rebecca said quickly, her hostess instincts kicking in despite her confusion. "I'm Rebecca Williams, Natalie's sister. This is my husband Marcus, and this is our friend Jennifer Morrison. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." David nodded politely at each introduction, but his attention remained focused on me. Jennifer, however, stepped forward with the aggressive confidence that had made her marketing agency successful. "David Chen," she said, extending her hand. "I've been trying to get a meeting with you for months. My agency handles several Fortune 500 accounts, and I think there could be some interesting synergies between our companies." David shook her hand briefly, professionally, but his expression remained neutral. "Ms. Morrison, isn't it? Yes, I received your proposals. Very thorough." Jennifer's eyes lit up at what she interpreted as encouragement, but I caught the diplomatic dismissal in David's tone. He'd perfected the art of being polite while revealing absolutely nothing. "Perhaps we could schedule some time to discuss," Jennifer began. "Actually," David interrupted gently, "I'm here on urgent business with Natalie. We have some sensitive matters to address." The room fell silent. Rebecca looked from David to me, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the confusion and growing suspicion in her eyes. "Business with Natalie?" she repeated slowly. "What kind of business?" I felt the weight of 8 months of careful deception pressing down on my shoulders. There was no graceful way out of this situation, no way to maintain the fiction I'd created, to protect my family from worrying about choices they wouldn't understand. "Perhaps we could speak privately," I suggested to David, gesturing toward Rebecca's living room. "Actually, what I have to tell you affects everyone here," David said. "Especially since I understand your family has been concerned about your employment situation." Marcus stepped forward, his lawyer instincts apparently overriding his social awkwardness. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen, but I think there might be some confusion. Natalie has been unemployed for several months. She's been looking for work, but—" "Unemployed?" David's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time since entering the house, he looked genuinely surprised. His gaze shifted to me, and I saw understanding dawn in his expression. "Natalie, you didn't tell them." It wasn't a question. David had always been perceptive about human nature, which was part of what made him such an effective CEO. He'd built Meridian Technologies from a basement startup into a billion-dollar company by reading people as well as he read market trends. "Tell? Us what?" Rebecca's voice had taken on that sharp edge I remembered from our childhood, the tone she used when she suspected I was hiding something significant. Jennifer sensed drama brewing and positioned herself to observe better, probably already, calculating how she could use whatever revelation was coming to her networking advantage. "Natalie," David said, his voice carrying the authority that commanded boardrooms full of executives twice his age. "Your family deserves to know the truth about your position at Meridian." "Position?" Marcus echoed. "What position?" I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the careful walls I'd built between my two worlds finally crumbling. When I opened them, David was watching me with something that might have been sympathy. "For the past 18 months, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest, "I've been working as the Chief Innovation Officer at Meridian Technologies." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the distant sound of Emma and Sophie's music upstairs. Rebecca broke first. Chief Innovation Officer? That's impossible. You told me you were unemployed. You couldn't afford lunch. You live in that tiny apartment. I live in that apartment because I choose to, I said. It's convenient downtown, and I don't need much space. As for lunch, I couldn't afford it because most of my compensation is tied up in company equity that I can't liquidate yet. Jennifer's expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching awe. As someone who followed tech industry news religiously, she clearly understood the implications of what I'd just revealed. Meridian Technologies, she said slowly. The company that just secured the $3 billion government contract for the new infrastructure project? David nodded. Among other recent developments. Wait, Marcus said, his analytical mind trying to process information that didn't fit his preconceptions. If Natalie works for your company, why has she been telling us she's unemployed? Because, I said, finally finding my voice, you all decided long ago what kind of person I was supposed to be. Rebecca wanted me to follow traditional paths, get married, buy a house in the suburbs, work a 9-to-5 job with predictable benefits. When I took the position at Meridian, when I chose equity over salary, when I decided to live minimally while building something significant, I knew you wouldn't understand. So you lied to us, Rebecca said, her voice tight with hurt and anger. I simplified, I corrected. I told you I was doing consulting work, which was true. I told you the income was variable, which was also true. I just didn't explain the scope or the potential. David cleared his throat, reminding us of his presence. If I may interrupt this family discussion, Natalie, we really do need to address the board's decision tonight. What decision? I asked, though part of me already suspected what was coming. The board met in an emergency session this evening to discuss the leadership transition plan we've been developing. After 18 months of watching you transform our innovation pipeline, after seeing how you've navigated the government contract, negotiations, after witnessing your ability to build consensus among stakeholders who rarely agree on anything, they've reached a unanimous conclusion. My heart began pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. They want to accelerate the succession timeline. Robert Patterson is stepping down as president and COO effective next month, and the board has approved you as his replacement. The words hit the room like a physical force. Jennifer actually gasped audibly. Marcus sat down heavily in one of Rebecca's designer chairs. Rebecca just stared at me as if I'd suddenly grown wings. Moreover, David continued, this promotion comes with immediate vesting of your equity positions and a compensation package that I believe will address any concerns about your financial stability. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. The formal offer is here, but I wanted to deliver the news personally. Congratulations, Natalie. In 3 weeks, you'll be the president and COO of Meridian Technologies and my direct successor as the company's future CEO. The envelope in David's hand seemed to weigh more than the entire house. Nobody moved for what felt like an eternity, the only sound being the grandfather clock in Rebecca's hallway marking each passing second with mechanical precision. Jennifer Morrison was the first to break the spell. President and COO of Meridian. Technologies, she whispered, and I could practically see the dollar signs calculating behind her eyes. Do you have any idea what that means? Rebecca looked between Jennifer and me, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen her display before. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to something that looked almost like betrayal. I don't understand, she said finally. Natalie, you sat at my table tonight and let me lecture you about being responsible. You let Marcus talk about entry-level positions. You let me worry about your future while you've been... She gestured helplessly at David, at the envelope, at the entire situation that had turned her worldview upside down. While I've been building something bigger than any of us imagined when I started, I finished quietly. David stepped closer to me, extending the envelope. Natalie, I know this is a family moment, but the board is expecting your response by tomorrow morning. The transition timeline is aggressive, and there are several key decisions that need your input. I took the envelope, feeling its weight in my hands. Through the paper, I could sense documents that would change everything. Not just my life, but my family's understanding of who I was and what I'd become. "Marcus," Jennifer said suddenly, her voice taking on that networking tone that made my skin crawl. "You should introduce me to your sister-in-law properly. I had no idea Rebecca's family had such impressive connections." The words hit Rebecca like a slap. I watched my sister's face crumple slightly as she realized that her friend's sudden interest wasn't in getting to know me better, but in exploiting whatever business opportunities I might represent. "Jennifer," Rebecca said stiffly, "I think maybe this isn't the best time." "Actually, it's the perfect time," Jennifer interrupted, pulling out her phone. "Natalie, I'd love to discuss how Morrison Marketing could support Meridian's expansion plans. We've worked with several tech companies on their growth strategies, and I think you'd find our approach very innovative." David's expression shifted to something I recognized from board meetings, polite but unmistakably dismissive. "Ms. Morrison, Meridian has a very selective partnership process. All potential collaborations go through our procurement department and involve extensive vetting. Procedures." Of course, Jennifer said quickly. "I just thought that since we're here and since Natalie and I go way back through Rebecca—" "We don't go way back," I said firmly. "We went to high school together 12 years ago and haven't spoken since graduation until tonight." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Jennifer's carefully maintained smile flickered, and I saw Marcus shift uncomfortably in his chair. Rebecca was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Natalie," David said, drawing my attention back to him, "there are a few immediate items we need to discuss. The Patterson Industries acquisition we've been negotiating. They've agreed to our terms, but they want to meet with the new president before finalizing the deal. I've scheduled a dinner meeting for Thursday night." "Patterson Industries?" Marcus said suddenly. "The manufacturing conglomerate?" "The same," David confirmed. "Their distribution network will give us access to markets we've been trying to penetrate for years." I opened the envelope David had given me, scanning the first page of the offer letter. The numbers were staggering, even more than I'd anticipated. The base salary alone was more than Rebecca and Marcus made combined, and the equity package would make me wealthy beyond anything my family had ever imagined. "There's something else," David continued. "The Wall Street Journal is running a feature story about leadership transitions in tech companies. They want to interview you about your promotion and your vision for Meridian's future. The article comes out next week." Rebecca sank into her chair, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. "The Wall Street Journal wants to interview my sister," she said to herself, as if testing how the word sounded. "Among other publications," David added. "Forbes is interested in featuring you in their Rising Stars issue, and TechCrunch wants to discuss your role in landing the government contract." Emma and Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the unusual voices coming from downstairs. They peered through the banister railings, teenage curiosity overcoming their instructions to stay in their rooms. "Girls, go back to your homework." Rebecca called up to them, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "Mom, who are these people?" Emma asked. "Sophie Googled that man's name, and he's like, super famous." David smiled up at them. "You must be Rebecca's daughters. Your aunt is about to become one of the youngest female executives in the tech industry." Sophie's eyes widened. "Aunt Natalie? The one who lives above the Vietnamese restaurant?" "The Thai." "Same one," I said, finding myself smiling despite the tension in the room. Jennifer seized what she saw as another networking opportunity. "Girls, your aunt is going to be incredibly influential in the business world. You should be very proud." But Emma and Sophie weren't paying attention to Jennifer. They were staring at me with the kind of awe that teenagers usually reserved for social media celebrities. "Are you going to be rich?" Emma asked with typical teenage directness. "Emma," Rebecca scolded, but I could see she was wondering the same thing. I'm going to be comfortable, I said carefully. More importantly, I'm going to be in a position to help build technology that could change how people live and work. David checked his watch, a simple but elegant piece that probably cost more than most people's cars. Natalie, I hate to rush this family reunion, but there's one more thing. The board wants to announce your promotion internally tomorrow, which means we need to brief the senior staff first thing in the morning. What time? I asked, my mind already shifting into professional mode. 7 a.m. I know it's early, but we want to control the narrative before word leaks to the press. Marcus cleared his throat. Natalie, I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but are you sure you're ready for this kind of responsibility? Running a major corporation is incredibly demanding. The question hung in the air like smoke. David's expression didn't change, but I could sense his attention sharpening. This was exactly the kind of doubt that my family's perception of me had always created. Marcus, I said calmly, I've been essentially running major portions of Meridian. For the past year, while David focused on strategic partnerships and board relations, the government contract everyone's talking about, I led those negotiations. The new product line that increased our market share by 30%, my team developed that. The efficiency improvements that saved the company $12 million. Last quarter, I implemented those systems. I stood up, feeling the weight of 18 months of hidden accomplishments settling on my shoulders like a mantle of authority I'd earned but never been able to display. The question isn't whether I'm ready for this responsibility, I continued. The question is whether this family is ready to see me as someone other than the little sister who needs guidance and protection. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but whether they were from pride, shame, or confusion, I couldn't tell. I'm sorry, she said quietly. We had no idea. You never told us how serious your work was, how successful you'd become. I tried to, in small ways. But every time I mentioned my projects or talked about the company's growth, you'd steer the conversation back to when I was going to get a real job or find a husband or buy a house in the suburbs. David stepped toward the door, recognizing that this family needed space to process what had just happened. Natalie, I'll send a car for you at 6:30 tomorrow morning. We have a lot of ground to cover before the staff meeting. I'll be ready, I said. Jennifer finally realized that her networking opportunity was slipping away. Natalie, before you go, could I just give you my card? I really think there could be some synergies. Jennifer, I interrupted gently, if you're interested in working with Meridian, submit a proposal through our website like everyone else. We evaluate all partnerships based on merit, not personal connections. The finality in my voice was unmistakable. Jennifer's smile became strained, but she nodded and stepped back. As David reached for the door handle, he turned back to address the room. For what it's worth, Mrs. Williams, your sister is one of the most capable executives I've ever worked with. Meridian is lucky to have her, and when I step down as CEO in 2 years, the company will be in excellent hands. After he left, the silence in Rebecca's perfectly appointed living room felt heavier than before, weighted with revelations and the uncomfortable realization that everything they thought they knew about me had been wrong. The sound of David's car pulling out of Rebecca's driveway seemed to echo through the house long after his taillights disappeared. Jennifer Morrison had left shortly after, making hurried excuses about needing to check on her own children, though I suspected she was really rushing home to research Meridian technologies and figure out how to insert herself into my professional orbit. Emma and Sophie had been sent back upstairs, but I could hear their muffled conversations and the occasional burst of excited laughter. Teenagers had a remarkable ability to adapt to new information, especially when that information made their previously boring aunt suddenly fascinating. Marcus poured himself another glass of wine, his third since dinner began. The alcohol hadn't made him more talkative. Instead, he seemed to retreat deeper into his own thoughts, occasionally glancing at me as if I were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Rebecca sat at her dining table, still in the same chair she'd occupied when she'd been lecturing me about responsibility an hour earlier. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was staring at the envelope David had given me, which lay unopened beside my water glass. 18 months, she said finally. You've been living this double life for 18 months. Not a double life, I corrected. I've been living one life and telling you about only part of it. That's semantics, Natalie, and you know it. Rebecca's voice carried a hurt I rarely heard from her. We're your family. We worried about you. I lost sleep thinking about your future, your security, your happiness. I know you did, I said softly. But look at what happened tonight when the truth came out. The first thing Jennifer wanted was to use me for business connections. Marcus immediately questioned whether I was capable of handling the responsibility. Even now, you're more focused on the fact that I didn't tell you than on what I've actually accomplished. Marcus set down his wine glass harder than necessary. That's not fair, Natalie. We're trying to process information that changes everything we thought we knew about you. But that's exactly the problem, I said, feeling frustration build in my chest. You thought you knew me, but you never really asked who I was becoming. You decided I was struggling, and every conversation we had reinforced that narrative. Rebecca stood up abruptly and began clearing the remaining dishes from dinner, her movements sharp and precise. So this is our fault? We're the bad guys because we cared about our sister who appeared to be unemployed and barely making ends meet? You're not the bad guys, I said, but you're not innocent either. Every time I tried to share something positive about my work, you'd dismiss it as freelance projects that couldn't possibly be important. When I mentioned working with government agencies, you assumed I was doing data entry. When I talked about equity compensation, you rolled your eyes and said I needed steady income. The sound of dishes being loaded into the dishwasher provided a staccato rhythm to our conversation. Rebecca's kitchen was a monument to efficiency and control. Every appliance perfectly placed, every surface spotless. It occurred to me that my sister had built a life that looked successful from the outside, but required constant maintenance to preserve the illusion. I have a confession to make, Marcus said suddenly. Both Rebecca and I turned to look at him. 3 months ago, I saw you coming out of the Meridian building downtown. You were wearing a business suit, carrying a leather briefcase, talking on your phone about budget allocations and staffing decisions. My stomach dropped. You saw me? I was there for a client meeting at the law firm across the street. I almost called out to you, but something about the way you carried yourself, the authority in your voice, made me hesitate. You looked like you belonged in that world in a way I'd never seen before. Rebecca stopped loading dishes and stared at her husband. You never told me that. I didn't know what to tell you. It didn't match the story Natalie had been telling us, but I couldn't figure out why she would lie about having a job, so I convinced myself I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen. You convinced yourself, I repeated, just like you've always convinced yourselves that I needed your guidance to make good decisions. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca turned off the water and faced me directly, her hands still wet from the dishes. You want to know the truth, Natalie? The real truth? We were scared. After college, when you turned down that position at Goldman Sachs to work for that tiny startup that nobody had ever heard of, we thought you were making a mistake. When that company failed and you moved to another startup, and then another one, we thought you were chasing fantasies. Those fantasies led me to Meridian, I said. We know that now, Marcus added. But at the time, watching you bounce from one uncertain situation to another, watching you choose risk over stability, it looked like you were sabotaging your own future. I picked up the envelope David had left, feeling its weight again. Inside were documents that would formalize my transition into one of the most powerful positions in the tech industry, but they couldn't repair the years of misunderstanding that had led to this moment. The startup that failed? I said. The one you thought was a waste of my time? David Chen was the CTO there. When it went under, he recruited 3 of us to help him launch Meridian. My willingness to take risks, to work for equity instead of salary, to believe in something bigger than immediate security. That's what got me here. Rebecca dried her hands slowly, methodically. And you never thought to tell us this story? To help us understand that your choices had logic behind them? I tried, I said. But every conversation turned into an intervention. Every family dinner became a lecture about my choices. After a while, it was easier to just avoid the subject entirely. Emma appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her teenage boldness overcoming her parents' instructions to stay upstairs. "Mom, can I ask Aunt Natalie something?" Rebecca sighed. "Emma, this is an adult conversation." "It's fine," I said. "What did you want to ask?" Emma approached cautiously, as if I might suddenly transform into someone else entirely. "Are you going to change now? Like, are you going to become all corporate and different?" The question was so innocent, so direct, that it cut through all the complex emotions swirling around the room. Out of the mouths of babes, as they say. "No, sweetheart. I'm still the same person I was when you came home from school today. The only thing that's changed is that now your parents know what I do for work." "But you're going to be super important," Emma said. "Sophie looked up your company online. It says you guys are building technology that could change the world." "We're trying to," I said. "But being important at work doesn't make me less important as your aunt." Emma seemed satisfied with this answer and retreated back upstairs, probably to report to her sister that I still seemed like the same person despite the evening's revelations. Marcus refilled his wine glass again, then sat back down at the dining table. "Natalie, I owe you an apology. We both do. We made assumptions about your life based on incomplete information, and then we used those assumptions to justify treating you like you needed our guidance instead of our respect." "I'm sorry, too," Rebecca said, sitting back down across from me. "I'm sorry we made you feel like you couldn't share your success with us. I'm sorry we created an environment where hiding your accomplishments felt like the safer choice." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, the first real emotion I'd allowed myself since David had walked through the front door. "I'm sorry I let you worry. I'm sorry I let you think I was struggling when I was actually building something incredible." "So what happens now?" Rebecca asked. "Tomorrow you become president and COO of a billion-dollar company, and we go back to our normal lives pretending this conversation never happened?" "No," I said firmly. "Tomorrow I start a new phase of my career, and we start a new phase of our relationship as a family. One based on honesty instead of assumptions." Marcus raised his wine glass slightly. "To honesty, then, and to family members who surprise us. To family members who trust us enough to share their real lives," Rebecca added, raising her water glass. I raised my own glass, feeling something shift in the space between us. Second chances and better communication. We drank to our tentative peace treaty, and for the first time in months, sitting in Rebecca's perfectly appointed dining room felt less like an interrogation and more like coming home. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, more focused. I stood in my studio apartment above Faux Saigon, watching the sunrise paint the Springfield skyline in shades of gold and amber. The familiar sounds of the city waking up, delivery trucks, early commuters, the restaurant staff preparing for another day, felt different somehow, like I was hearing them through new ears. My phone buzzed at exactly 6 a.m. with a text from David. "Car will be there in 30 minutes. Ready to change the world?" I smiled at his characteristic blend of pragmatism and ambition. David had always understood that big changes happened through small, deliberate steps, and today would be filled with both. The black sedan that pulled up outside the restaurant was understated but elegant, the kind of car that whispered rather than shouted about its owner's success. The driver, a professional woman in her 50s named Patricia, greeted me with the kind of efficient warmth that suggested she'd been ferrying executives around for years. "Congratulations on your promotion." Ms. Rodriguez, she said as we pulled into morning traffic, Mr. Chen speaks very highly of your work. Thank you, Patricia. I have to admit, it still feels surreal. The first day in a new role always does, she replied. But from what I've observed, the people who feel that way are usually the ones who take the responsibility seriously. The Meridian Technologies. Building rose 32 floors above downtown Springfield, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning light like a beacon. I'd walked into this building hundreds of times over the past 18 months, but today felt fundamentally different. Today I wasn't just going to work. I was stepping into a role that would define the next decade of my career. David was waiting for me in the executive elevator, dressed in his usual impeccably tailored suit, but with an expression that mixed pride with something that looked almost like relief. "How did the rest of the evening go with your family?" he asked as we rose toward the 31st floor. "Better than I expected," I said. "Painful, but necessary. They're trying to understand why I felt the need to hide all of this from them." "And are you understanding it better yourself?" It was a perceptive question, the kind David was known for, asking. He had a gift for cutting through surface emotions to find the deeper truths that drove people's decisions. I think I was protecting myself as much as protecting them, I admitted. If they didn't know about my success, they couldn't inadvertently undermine it with their doubts. The elevator opened onto the executive floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city. David's corner office occupied prime real estate, but today we walked past it toward the conference room where the senior leadership team was already assembled. 8 of the most influential people in Springfield's business community sat around, a polished mahogany table, each representing a different aspect of Meridian's operations. Sarah Blackwood, our chief financial officer, had flown in from New York specifically for this meeting. Thomas Rivera, who headed our government relations division, looked up from his tablet as we entered. Dr. Jennifer Chang, our chief technology officer, smiled warmly in my direction. These were people I'd worked with closely for months, but seeing them gathered to discuss my promotion felt like viewing familiar faces through a new lens. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said, taking his place at the head of the table. "As you know, Robert Patterson submitted his formal resignation as president and COO last week to pursue other opportunities. The board has moved quickly to name his replacement, and I'm pleased to announce that effective immediately, Natalie Rodriguez will be stepping into the role of President and Chief Operating Officer." The applause was warm and genuine, but I could see calculations happening behind several pairs of eyes. Corporate promotions always triggered a complex dance of relationships and power dynamics, and everyone in the room was already adjusting their understanding of how Meridian's hierarchy would function going forward. "Natalie," Sarah said, "congratulations. I look forward to working more closely with you on the quarterly projections and the Patterson Industries integration." "Thank you, Sarah. I'm looking forward to diving deeper into the financial modeling for the expansion plans." Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "The timing is actually perfect, Natalie. The Department of Commerce has some questions about our implementation timeline for the infrastructure contract. Having someone with your technical background in the president's role should help address their concerns." Dr. Chang nodded in agreement. "The development teams have been asking for more direct access to executive decision-making. Your background in innovation management should streamline a lot of processes that have been bottlenecked at the board level." As the conversation continued around the table, I realized that my colleagues had been watching my work more closely than I'd understood. They weren't surprised by my promotion. They were relieved that someone with operational experience was finally taking the reins. "There's something else we need to discuss," David said, his tone shifting slightly. "As many of you know, I've been planning my transition out of day-to-day operations for some time. The board has accelerated that timeline. 18 months from today, I'll be stepping down as CEO, and Natalie will be taking over full leadership of the company." This announcement created a different kind of silence around the table. CEO successions were rare events in the corporate world, especially at companies as successful as Meridian. Everyone in the room was suddenly looking at me not just as their new president, but as their future CEO. That's a significant timeline acceleration, Sarah observed. What prompted the board to move so quickly? Several factors, David replied. The government contract positions us for unprecedented growth over the next 2 years. The Patterson acquisition will double our manufacturing capacity. And frankly, Natalie has demonstrated leadership capabilities that convinced the board she's ready for increased responsibility sooner rather than later. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it discreetly and saw Rebecca's name. Saw the Meridian press release online. So proud of you. Love, your big sister. The simple message hit me harder than I'd expected. For years, Rebecca had been the successful one, the one with the stable career and the perfect life that served as an implicit comparison point for my own choices. Having her acknowledge my achievements publicly felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. Natalie, Thomas said, drawing my attention back to the meeting. There's a practical issue we need to address immediately. The Wall Street Journal. Interview is scheduled for tomorrow, and they're going to want to discuss your vision for Meridian's future. How do you want to handle questions about the leadership transition? Transparently, I said. David and I have worked closely together for 18 months. This isn't a sudden change of direction. It's a planned evolution of leadership that reflects the company's growth trajectory. Dr. Chang smiled. That's a good approach. The tech press has been speculating about Meridian's long-term strategy since we landed the government contract. Having a clear succession plan should actually strengthen investor confidence. The meeting continued for another hour, covering everything from quarterly earnings projections to the complex logistics of integrating Patterson Industries into Meridian's operations. With each topic we discussed, I felt more settled into the role, more confident that the skills I'd developed over the past 18 months had prepared me for this level of responsibility. As the senior staff filed out of the conference room, David gestured for me to stay behind. "How are you feeling?" he asked once we were alone. "Overwhelmed, excited, terrified, and grateful," I said. "Sometimes all at the same time." "That's exactly how you should be feeling. The day you stop feeling those things is the day you should probably step down." David walked over to the window, looking out at the city sprawling below us. "There's something I want to tell you, something I've never shared with anyone else at the company." I waited, sensing that whatever he was about to say was important. When I started Meridian, I had a very specific vision for what kind of company I wanted to build. Not just profitable, but meaningful. Not just successful, but sustainable. I wanted to create something that would outlast my own involvement, something that would continue to grow and innovate long after I moved on to other challenges. He turned back to face me. "Watching you work over the past 18 months, seeing how you've handled complex negotiations, difficult personnel decisions, and strategic planning challenges, I realized that you embody everything I hoped this company could become. You're not just my successor, Natalie. You're proof that the culture we've built here actually works." The weight of his words settled over me like a mantle. This wasn't just about taking over a company. It was about stewarding. Something larger than myself. Something that could impact thousands of employees and millions of customers for decades to come. "I won't let you down," I said. "I know you won't," David replied. "But more importantly, you won't let yourself down. And that's the difference between someone who holds a position and someone who truly leads." The Wall Street Journal interview took place in Meridian's executive boardroom, with downtown Springfield's skyline providing a dramatic backdrop through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Catherine Wells, the journal's senior technology correspondent, had arrived with a photographer and enough recording equipment to suggest this wasn't going to be a simple Q&A session. "Ms. Rodriguez," Catherine began, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she reviewed her notes. "Let's start with the obvious question. 3 days ago, Virtually no one in the business world had heard your name. Today, you're the president and COO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in America. How does someone achieve that level of success while remaining completely under the radar? I'd anticipated this question, but hearing it articulated so directly still made me pause. The truth was more complex than any soundbite could capture. I think the premise of your question contains an assumption that isn't quite accurate, I said. I haven't been under the radar within the technology and government contracting sectors. Over the past 18 months, I've been deeply involved in negotiations with federal agencies, merger discussions with major corporations, and strategic partnerships that have positioned Meridian for the growth we're experiencing now. What's new isn't my work. It's the public recognition of that work. Catherine nodded, making notes on her tablet. But you have to admit, it's unusual for someone to rise to such a senior position without the typical markers of executive visibility. Speaking engagements, industry awards, media profiles. I've been focused on results rather than recognition, I replied. When you're building something significant, there's often a choice between spending time promoting yourself and spending time on the actual work. I chose the work. The photographer moved around the room, capturing different angles as Catherine continued her questions. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see other Meridian employees going about their daily routines, but several paused to glance in our direction. Word of the interview had spread quickly through the company. Let's talk about the government contract, Catherine said. $3 billion for infrastructure technology development is the kind of deal that established companies with decades of experience compete for. How did Meridian, a relatively young company, manage to secure such a significant project? This was the question I'd been most looking forward to answering, because it went to the heart of what made Meridian different from its competitors. Traditional government contractors often approach these projects with legacy thinking, I explained. They propose solutions based on existing technology and incremental improvements. We approached the infrastructure challenge from first principles, asking not, how can we do this better? But what would we build if we were starting from scratch today? Can you be more specific? Certainly. Most infrastructure monitoring systems are built on centralized models that create single points of failure. Our proposal was based on distributed, self-healing networks that can maintain functionality even when individual components fail. We didn't just offer a better version of existing technology, we offered a fundamentally different approach to solving the problem. Catherine's questions continued for another hour, covering everything from Meridian's corporate culture to my personal background, to the company's expansion plans. With each answer, I felt more comfortable in my role as the public face of the company, more confident in my ability to articulate our vision to external stakeholders. One final question, Catherine said as the photographer began packing up his equipment. There's been speculation in the industry about CEO succession at Meridian. David Chen has been remarkably successful, but he's still relatively young. Are there plans for leadership transition in the near future? I'd discussed this question with David extensively, and we'd agreed on complete transparency. David will be transitioning out of the CEO role 18 months from now, I said. This has been part of his long-term vision for the company from the beginning. He's always believed that sustainable organizations need to develop leadership from within and plan for succession before it becomes necessary. And you'll be taking over as CEO? That's the current plan, pending board approval. David and I have been working closely together to ensure a smooth transition that maintains Meridian's momentum while positioning the company for its next phase of growth. After Catherine and her team left, I found myself alone in the boardroom, looking out at the city that had been home to my hidden success for the past 18 months. My phone had been buzzing constantly with messages, LinkedIn connection requests from people I'd never met, interview requests from other publications, congratulations from colleagues across the industry. David appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the espresso machine in his office. "How did it feel?" he asked, handing me one of the cups. Like I was finally telling the whole truth about what we've been building here, I said. I hadn't realized how much energy it took to constantly minimize our accomplishments when people asked about my work. The article comes out tomorrow, David said. Are you prepared for what happens next? What do you mean? Natalie, you're about to become one of the most visible female executives in the tech industry. That comes with opportunities, but it also comes with scrutiny, expectations, and a level of public attention that can be overwhelming if you're not prepared for it. Before I could respond, my personal phone rang. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen, and I answered without thinking. Natalie, thank God you picked up. Rebecca's voice was breathless with excitement. I just got off the phone with Mom. She saw the press release about your promotion and she's been crying for 20 minutes. Our mother lived in Phoenix, where she'd moved after Dad passed away 3 years earlier. We spoke regularly, but I'd been even less forthcoming with her about my career than I had with Rebecca. She knew I worked in technology, but she had no concept of the scope or significance of what I did. Is she okay? I asked. She's proud, Natalie. She's so incredibly proud. She keeps saying she always knew you were destined for something special, but she had no idea it was this special. Through the conference room windows, I could see the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city. In a few hours, I'd be driving back to my studio apartment above Faux Saigon. But everything about that routine felt different now. Rebecca, can I ask you something? Of course. Last night, when you said you'd been worried about me, about my future, what specifically were you worried about? There was a pause, and I could hear voices in the background. Emma and Sophie arriving home from school, their teenage energy filling Rebecca's perfectly organized house. I was worried you'd end up alone, Rebecca said finally. Not romantically, necessarily, but professionally, financially, socially. I was worried that your willingness to take risks would leave you without the kind of security and stability that let you build a real life. And now? Now I'm worried I don't know my sister as well as I thought I did. But it's a different kind of worry. It's the kind of worry you have when you realize someone you love is capable of things you never imagined. After ending the call with Rebecca, I walked down to the 28th floor, where Meridian's Innovation Lab occupied an entire floor of open workspace. The lab was where our most experimental projects took shape, where engineers and designers collaborated on solutions that wouldn't reach the market for years. Dr. Chang was there, reviewing prototypes with a team of developers who'd been working on next-generation interface design. She looked up as I approached, her expression shifting to one of professional deference that made me slightly uncomfortable. Natalie, Ms. Rodriguez, congratulations again on the promotion. Please, Jennifer, we've been colleagues for over a year. I'm still the same person I was yesterday. She smiled, but I could see the adjustment happening in her mind, the subtle recalibration of our professional relationship that my new title necessitated. There's something I wanted to discuss with you, actually, she said. Now that you're president, you'll have budget authority for some projects that have been stalled at the board level. What kind of projects? Jennifer led me to a workstation where multiple monitors displayed complex technical diagrams and data visualizations. We've been developing predictive algorithms for urban infrastructure management, essentially systems, that can anticipate maintenance needs, traffic patterns, and resource allocation before problems occur. The implications hit me immediately. This could revolutionize how cities operate. Exactly. But it requires significant investment in research and development, plus partnerships with municipal governments that are notoriously slow to adopt new technology. I studied the displays, recognizing the kind of long-term thinking that had made Meridian successful. This wasn't about quarterly profits. It was about building technology that could improve millions of lives over decades. What do you need from me? Authorization to expand the team and begin pilot programs with 3 major cities. The total investment would be about $12 million over 2 years. but the potential market is worth hundreds of millions. Prepare a detailed proposal and budget breakdown, I said. I want to review it with the full executive team next week. Jennifer's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd been drawn to the tech industry in the first place. Here were people who genuinely believed that technology could make the world better, who were willing to invest years of their lives in projects that might fail, but could also change everything. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Jennifer Morrison. I hope you'll reconsider our conversation about potential partnerships. I've attached some materials that demonstrate Morrison Marketing's experience with tech sector clients. I deleted the message without opening the attachment. Some things never changed. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, David knocked on the door of what was now my office. A corner space with views in two directions and enough room for a small conference table where I could hold informal meetings. There's one more thing we need to discuss, he said, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. The board wants to schedule a press conference for next week, something more formal than the Wall Street Journal interview. They want to make a public statement about the leadership transition and the company's strategic direction. What kind of press conference? Full media availability, local news, national business press, industry publications, financial analysts. Probably about 50 people, all asking questions about everything from your background to Meridian's stock price to your plans for the company's future. The thought of facing 50 journalists simultaneously was daunting, but I realized it was also necessary. If I was going to be the public face of Meridian, I needed to establish myself as someone who could handle scrutiny and communicate effectively with all of our stakeholders. When were you thinking? Thursday afternoon. That gives us time to prepare, talking points, and coordinate with our communications team. And you'll be there? For this one, yes. But Natalie, part of this transition means you becoming comfortable being the primary spokesperson for the company. I won't always be available to share the spotlight. That evening, as I sat in my studio, apartment eating takeout from the restaurant downstairs, I reflected on how much had changed in just 3 days. The same walls, the same furniture, the same view of downtown Springfield. But everything felt different because my relationship to the world outside had been fundamentally altered. My laptop was open to a dozen news articles about Meridian, about the government contract, about my promotion. The comments sections were filled with speculation about my qualifications, my background, and my ability to lead a major corporation. Some were supportive, others skeptical, a few overtly hostile in the way that female executives often encountered online. But mixed in with the noise were messages from people whose names I recognized, former colleagues, professors from Northwestern, even high school classmates who'd somehow tracked down my contact information. The overwhelming theme was surprise followed by pride, as if people were suddenly remembering interactions we'd had and reinterpreting them in light of this new information about my career. Emma had sent me a friend request on Instagram, which felt simultaneously sweet and surreal. Sophie had tagged me in a TikTok video about cool aunts who run companies, which had somehow gotten 3,000 views in 4 hours. My mother called just as I was getting ready for bed. "Mija," she said, using the Spanish endearment she'd called me since childhood. "I'm so proud I can barely speak." "Thank you, Mom. But I have to ask, why didn't you tell me? All this time I thought you were struggling, and you were actually building an empire." "Not an empire, Mom, just a career." "Don't minimize this, Natalie. What you've accomplished, especially as a young woman in a field dominated by men, this is extraordinary." As I lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the city settling into evening rhythms, I realized that the hardest part wasn't going to be learning how to run a major corporation. The hardest part was going to be learning how to live with the public recognition of success I'd spent 18 months keeping private. But for the first time in years, I felt like all the pieces of my life were finally aligned. My family knew who I really was, my colleagues understood my capabilities, and I had a clear path forward that would let me build something meaningful while staying true to the values that had gotten me this far. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new responsibilities. But tonight, I was simply Natalie Rodriguez, sleeping above a Vietnamese restaurant in downtown Springfield, dreaming about changing the world. The press conference was held in the Meridian Building's main auditorium, a space typically reserved for quarterly earnings presentations and company-wide meetings. But today, it buzzed with the energy of 50 journalists, financial analysts, and industry observers who had gathered to witness what many were calling the most significant leadership announcement in Springfield's business community in over a decade. I stood backstage, adjusting my navy blue blazer and reviewing the talking points I'd memorized over the past week. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see camera crews from 3 national news networks setting up their equipment. The Wall Street Journal article had generated more interest than anyone had anticipated, and what was supposed to be a regional business story had somehow become national news. David appeared beside me, his usual calm demeanor masking what I suspected was his own nervousness about stepping back from the spotlight he'd occupied for years. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as anyone can be for something they've never done before?" I replied. "The key is to remember that everyone in that room wants you to succeed. They're not looking for reasons to doubt you. They're looking for reasons to believe in Meridian's future." We walked onto the stage together, and I was struck by the sudden intensity of attention focused in our direction. Cameras flashed, recording. Devices were activated, and 50 pairs of eyes tracked our movement across the platform. David approached the podium first, his opening remarks brief but substantive. He outlined Meridian's growth trajectory, the significance of recent contract wins, and the strategic thinking behind accelerating the leadership transition. Then he stepped aside, and suddenly I was alone at the microphone, facing an audience. That would determine how the business world perceived both me and the company I was about to lead. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. 3 years ago, Meridian Technologies was a startup with big ideas and limited resources. Today, we're a company that's helping to redesign how America thinks about infrastructure, technology, and the intersection between public needs and private innovation. I paused, making eye contact with different sections of the audience, a technique I'd learned during my Northwestern presentation classes that now felt like a lifetime ago. The question I've been asked most frequently over the past week is how someone relatively unknown could suddenly emerge in such a senior role. I'd like to address that directly because I think it reflects a broader misunderstanding about how leadership actually develops in the modern economy. The room was completely quiet, the kind of focused attention that speakers dream about but rarely achieve. I haven't been unknown. I've been working. For 18 months, I've been negotiating with federal agencies, managing complex technical projects, and building the systems that allowed Meridian to compete for and win contracts that established companies with decades more experience couldn't secure. What's changed isn't my capabilities, it's your awareness of them. A hand shot up in the front row. Catherine Wells from the Wall Street Journal, whose article had started this wave of attention. "Ms. Rodriguez, can you address concerns that your promotion represents a significant risk for shareholders, given your lack of traditional executive experience?" It was a fair question, and one I'd anticipated. Traditional executive experience often means managing established processes and incrementally improving existing systems. Meridian's success has come from thinking differently, from approaching problems with fresh perspectives rather than conventional wisdom. The skills that got us here, innovation, adaptability, strategic thinking about emerging technologies, those are the skills that will carry us forward. Another reporter raised his hand. "What's your response to critics who say this promotion is primarily about optics, about putting a young woman in a visible role to improve the company's image?" The question carried an undercurrent of skepticism that I'd encountered throughout my career, the implication that my achievements were somehow less legitimate because of my gender and age. I'd invite those critics to examine the results I've delivered, I said, allowing a slight edge to enter my voice. The government infrastructure contract I negotiated will generate over $3 billion in revenue. The efficiency improvements I implemented have saved Meridian $12 million in operational costs. The Patterson Industries acquisition I structured will double our manufacturing capacity. If those accomplishments are about optics, then I suggest we need more executives focused on the same kind of optics. The response drew appreciative chuckles from several journalists, and I sensed the mood in the room shifting toward something more supportive. For the next 45 minutes, questions covered everything from Meridian's international expansion plans to my personal background to the challenges facing women in technology leadership roles. With each answer, I felt more comfortable, more confident in my ability to represent the company in public forums. As the press conference concluded, I noticed my phone vibrating with what seemed like constant notifications. During the brief break, while photographers took final shots, I glanced at the screen and saw dozens of messages from people across my network. Rebecca had sent a photo of herself, Marcus, Emma, and Sophie, watching the press conference live on their laptop, with the caption, "So proud of our CEO sister." My Northwestern roommate Sarah had texted, "Watching you on Bloomberg right now. Remember when you said you were going to change the world? Guess you weren't kidding." Even my high school chemistry teacher had somehow found my number. "Natalie, I always knew you were destined for greatness. Congratulations from Mrs. Patterson. Yes, I kept my maiden name even after retirement." But the message that hit me hardest came from an unexpected source, Jennifer Morrison. "Natalie, I owe you an apology. Watching your press conference made me realize I was trying to use you rather than genuinely celebrate your success. You handled everything with such grace and professionalism. Springfield is lucky to have leaders like you." David appeared at my elbow as journalists began packing up their equipment. "How do you feel?" he asked. Like I just passed some kind of test I didn't know I was taking, I said. "That's exactly what you did, and you passed with flying colors." That evening, Rebecca had insisted on hosting what she called a proper celebration dinner at her house. But unlike the tense family intervention of a week earlier, this gathering felt completely different. Marcus had actually taken time off from his law firm to be there. Emma and Sophie had made a banner that read, "Congratulations, CEO Aunt Natalie," in glittery letters that shed all over Rebecca's dining room. Even my mother had flown in from Phoenix, claiming she couldn't miss such an important moment in her daughter's life. As we sat around the same mahogany table where I'd been lectured about responsibility just days before, the conversation flowed with an ease that had been missing from our family dynamics for years. "I have a confession," my mother said, raising her wine glass. "When Natalie was in high school, her guidance counselor told me she had the highest aptitude scores they'd ever recorded for analytical thinking and problem solving. I always wondered what she would do with those gifts." "Why didn't you ever tell me that?" I asked. "Because you were already putting so much pressure on yourself to succeed. I didn't want to add to that burden by giving you even higher expectations to live up to." Emma, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during dinner, suddenly spoke up. "Aunt Natalie, can I ask you something kind of personal?" "Sure, sweetheart. Are you going to have kids? I mean, now that you're super successful and everything?" The question caught me off guard, partly because it was so direct, and partly because it touched on decisions I'd been avoiding for years. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Running a major company is incredibly demanding, and I'm not sure how to balance that with the kind of family life I'd want to provide for children." "But you could afford the best childcare," Sophie pointed out with teenage logic. "It's not about affording childcare," Rebecca said gently. "It's about having the time and energy to be present for the important moments." "Actually," Marcus said, surprising everyone, I think Natalie might have more flexibility than traditional executives. Meridian's culture seems to prioritize results over FaceTime, and she's been instrumental in building that culture. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering everything from my plans for Meridian's future to my thoughts on work-life balance to my mother's suggestions for redecorating my studio apartment. Mija, you can afford a bigger place. Now, as the evening wound down and family members began preparing to leave, Rebecca pulled me aside in her kitchen. I owe you a bigger apology than I gave you last week, she said. It wasn't just that we didn't know about your success. It's that we didn't trust you to make good decisions about your own life. Rebecca, we've been through this. No, let me finish. You were right when you said we decided who you were supposed to be and then judged you against that standard. We should have been asking who you wanted to become and how we could support that journey. I hugged my sister, feeling years of tension and misunderstanding finally dissolving between us. So what happens now? She asked. Now I learn how to run a billion-dollar company while staying connected to the people who matter most to me, I said. 3 months later, I was sitting in what had become my regular booth at Faux Saigon, reviewing quarterly projections on my laptop, while Mrs. Nguyen, the restaurant owner, brought me my usual order of pho thai and spring rolls. You still live upstairs? She asked, as she did every week. Still live upstairs, I confirmed. Good. Important to remember where you come from. The Patterson Industries acquisition had closed ahead of schedule, adding 847 employees to Meridian's workforce and positioning us to bid on infrastructure projects across multiple states. The urban planning algorithms Jennifer Chang's team had developed were being tested in pilot programs in Detroit, Austin, and Portland, with early results suggesting they could reduce traffic congestion by up to 30%. My phone rang. David calling from Singapore, where he was exploring partnerships with Asian technology firms. How did the board meeting go? He asked. Unanimous approval for the international expansion plan, I said. We'll be opening offices in London and Tokyo within 6 months. And how are you handling the increased responsibility? Better than I expected. The work is complex, but it's not fundamentally different from what I was doing before, just larger in scale and with more public attention. Any regrets about accepting the promotion? I looked around the modest restaurant that had been my neighborhood. Anchor for over a year, then up at the ceiling toward the small apartment where I still chose to live despite being able to afford virtually anything I wanted. None at all, I said. Though I think my family is still adjusting to having a CEO in the group. Give them time. Major life changes take a while to feel normal for everyone involved. After ending the call, I returned to my financial projections, but my attention was interrupted by a familiar voice from the restaurant's entrance. Excuse me, is this where Natalie Rodriguez lives? I looked up to see a young woman, probably in her early 20s, holding a worn manila folder and looking nervous. I'm Natalie Rodriguez, I said. Her face lit up with recognition and relief. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Maria Santos. I'm a computer science major at Springfield University, and I've been following Meridian's work for months. I was wondering if you might look at some code I've been working on. It's related to network security protocols, and I think it might be something your company could use. I gestured to the empty seat across from me. Sit down, Maria. Tell me about your project. As she opened her folder and began explaining her work with the kind of passionate enthusiasm I remembered feeling at her age, I realized that this was perhaps the most important part of my new role. Not just running a successful company, but inspiring the next generation of innovators who would eventually build something even more significant than what we'd accomplished. 6 months later, Maria Santos became Meridian's youngest intern. Her security protocols were integrated into our government contracts, and she was featured in Fortune magazine's list of rising stars in technology. But that afternoon in Faux Saigon, listening to a brilliant young woman explain her vision for improving cybersecurity infrastructure, I understood that success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about creating opportunities for others to achieve their own version of the impossible. The little girl who had dreamed of changing the world from her childhood bedroom in a working-class neighborhood had grown up to become exactly who she'd always known she could be. She just had to wait for the rest of the world to catch up and recognize what had been true all along. That extraordinary things often happen quietly, in small apartments above Vietnamese restaurants, by people who choose to do the work regardless of whether anyone is watching. And sometimes, if you're patient enough and persistent enough, the moment comes when everyone finally sees what you've been building all along. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.